We are live on Facebook, it would seem. Just got an email. Right, we're live on Facebook. We are also on Torah Anytime, and we are on Zoom. So there's lots and lots of different ways of doing things. And of course, we have Trusted Ivor here, so somebody here to actually listen to me in person as well. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight, for joining us, and I'd like to speak about a few different parts of the Pasha tonight. One of them is actually very interesting. It's an idea that Rav Hirsch brings here. He brings it in a few places, but this is the first time I think that he brings it, and he brings it later on by Yaakov Avinu. Also, it is an idea of Rav Hirsch. Not everybody seems to agree with it, but I think it is a very important idea to realize and to recognize. So let's start with the following. Avram Avinu is commanded, Lech Lecha me'artzecha mimalatcha mibeis avicha. Avram Avinu is commanded to go from his homeland to the land that God is going to show him. And there God's going to make him into a great nation, and he will bless him and give him great wealth, etc., etc. And Avram Avinu says, okay, off we go. He starts traveling. He has no idea where he's going. He has no idea how far he needs to go until he gets to the land of Israel. And that's where God says, okay, here we go. Here we are. And Avram Avinu reaches the promised land and the blessed land, the land where he's going to flourish and become great, etc., etc. And the first thing that happens when he reaches Eretz Yisrael is what? No, he doesn't blow his nose. The first thing that happens when he reaches Eretz Yisrael is there's a famine. Okay? Vayira of Ba'aretz. And Rashi says, or some of the Farshim say, that there was only a famine in Eretz Yisrael. There wasn't a famine anywhere else, which would make it really difficult. If you've just been promised by God, I'm taking you to the promised land. This is going to be the land that you're going to love, and it's going to be amazing, etc., etc. And you're all excited, and you show up over there, and the first thing that happens is there's a famine. What would you say? Not a very good place. You know, when you sometimes you go on these holiday rentals, you hire a house and you're like, I'm not sure if this is right, I'm not sure if this is wrong. Have you ever taken a holiday house and you showed up over there and the place looked an absolute churban, it looked an absolute like a dive? So sometimes it looks like a dive and you show up and you're like, your wife's like, why did we have to do this so cheap? Could we not have spent a little bit of extra money and done this in a hotel? Why did we have to do this? So that's one answer you could get. But even if you don't get the thing off your wife goes, wow, this place is beautiful. And then you go into the bathroom the first time, you go, this is a great place. I'm just going to wash my hands. And you turn the tap, you turn the sink, and the faucet comes off in your hand. And at that point, you know already right away, we are on to a loser. This is only going to get worse from here. It is not going to get better. And so Avram Avinu is given a tremendous test over here because God tells him, come to the land, the blessed land, the land that's going to be amazing, wonderful. You're going to love it here. And Avram Avinu shows up only for there to be a famine in that land and in no other land. So that's a real test of Avram Avinu. And then Avram Avinu makes his way down to Egypt. And the question is, when Avram Avinu made his way down to Egypt, did he do the right thing or did he do the wrong thing? So according to Rashi, this was one of the tests. And Avram Avinu, this is the test. Avram Avinu was going to make his way down to Egypt. And it was a test from God to see, would Avram Avinu complain to God and say, hey, God, that's not really what I expected from you, or would Avram Avinu just take it on the chin? That's the way that Rashi learns it. Ramban says very differently. Ramban says over here, Vedai, you should know. Sorry, I'm looking down because I have my chumash over here. I don't have enough space because I don't have a table. Vedai, you should know. Ki Avram Avinu chotochet gadol bishgog. Avram Avinu did a big avera, but by accident. Shehevi Ishtat Tzadek is he brought his wife into a problem over here because he was worried they're going to kill him, and he should have trusted Hashem that Hashem will save him. As well as Gam Yitziasum in Haaretz, when you left the land, Avram Avinu, you did something wrong. Why'd you leave the land? God said, go to Israel. You show up in Israel, there's a famine, you just rough it out. What did you move on for? That is what Nachmanides says. So we have over here a disagreement between Nachmanides and Rashi about whether Avram Avinu did the right thing or Avram Avinu did the wrong thing for moving down to Eretz Yisrael, from Eretz Yisrael to Egypt. And here Rav Hirsch says something that, again, as I said, Rav Hirsch says this a few times in Chumash, and here I think is the first time I've seen him say it, is we have to know that in Judaism, whilst we have unbelievable respect for our great people, and we understand that our great people even if they do make mistakes, they are mistakes on a level that you and I wouldn't really fully understand. However, we have to realize and we have to understand that our greatest of people could still make an error. And that's what Nachmanides is telling us. Our great people can make mistakes. So you say, well, what? They're human beings. Now, you might say, well, if I say that our great people can make mistakes, isn't that somehow detracting from their greatness? I thought this was the greatest person ever, and now you're telling me he also made mistakes. Well, okay, well then he's not the greatest person ever. And what Rav Hirsch tells us is a very important idea and a very important lesson. And that's the following. He brings it out with Moshe Rabbeinu, but I think it's true in all instances. When you read about Moshe Rabbeinu, what's the one characteristic that Moshe Rabbeinu exemplifies? That the Torah says Moshe Rabbeinu is the greatest X of all people. Humble. Moshe Rabbeinu is the most humble of all people. That's what the Torah tells us in Baal Oscha. Moshe Rabbeinu is the most humble of all people. There's never been another person as humble as Moshe Rabbeinu. Now you might say, yeah, you know why Moshe Rabbeinu is the most humble of all people? Because he had a great temperament, because he never got upset, because things were always, he took everything easy. You know, certain people, they're like almost horizontal. That's how laid back they are. No matter what you say, nothing can faze them and nothing ever gets to them. She said, you know why Moshe Rabbeinu was most humble of all people? Because nothing could ever faze Moshe Rabbeinu. He'd never feel bad about anything. He'd never get upset. That just was Moshe Rabbeinu. So then the Torah tells you the following. You know what the Torah says? The Torah says Moshe Rabbeinu brings the Jewish people to the rock. And the Jewish people are driving him absolutely meshuggah. We have nothing to drink. And God said, speak to the rock. And the Jewish people are, again, driving him crazy. And he takes the stick, and what does he say? What does he say? Do you remember that one, Clive? Do you remember that one? He says, Shimu no hamorim. Yeah? Listen, you that are rebellious. What, you want me to get water out of this stone? How do you get water out of a stone? And then he hits the stone, and the stone gives forth water, etc. And that's the end of that story. Says Rav Hirsch, what does that story prove to me? It proves to me that Moshe Rabbeinu was actually capable of getting angry. It's not that he's incapable of getting angry. Because you know what? If he's incapable of getting angry, then there's no big deal for the fact that he never got angry. And he was the most humble person around. Of course he's the most humble person around. But when Moshe Rabbeinu has the capability of getting angry and is still described as the most humble of all people, the person that really understood that with all his greatness, there's still so much between him and God. That's greatness. Greatness is when you have somebody that can get angry and still doesn't get angry. Greatness is somebody that would have the propensity to be arrogant and is humble. Greatness is not somebody who's just not wired that way. You know, when you have people, sometimes I remember in class, you have, I'm sure all of us had this. Do you remember, you had pupils in class that were like, they were the geniuses? Do you know what I mean? They knew everything and anything. And no matter what it was, no matter how hard you tried to study for that test, who always got the best result? Bob, right? Because Bob was the class genius. And then you had Bob, and you'd ask Bob, how much did you study last night? Well, last night I took out the notes and I read through them 5 minutes. I'm not sure I know the stuff. He always got 100, plus he got the bonus questions, so he got 110 on the test. And you spent 3 or 4 hours slogging on the test, and you got an 87, and you were all proud of yourself. Look, I got an 87, and Bob goes, I got 106. No, I'll never catch up with Bob, right? On the other hand, so what? So Bob's a genius. But if Bob's a genius, is there any greatness in the fact that Bob gets 110%? There's no greatness in it because he's a genius. It takes him only 3 minutes to study it. Whatever the teacher says goes in one ear and stays there forever. So he does well. Big deal. The person that is forgetful, the person that is not as clever, that can sit down and study and bring himself to get over 100% is greater than Bob. because his normal grade should have been a 56. And the only reason he got a 106 is because he worked hard, because he put himself into it. And that's what he says about Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu is brought out to us by the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu could make a mistake. Because if Moshe Rabbeinu could not make a mistake, then as great as he is, he's sort of, there's no way I can compare myself to him. I still have no way to compare myself to him, even when he makes a mistake. But if he never made mistakes, then I'd say, look, the man's infallible. What do you want from me? I'm just a regular human being. I'm not infallible. How do you expect me to look at Moshe Rabbeinu and to say, that's it? And then he takes it one step further, and this is where it gets even more interesting. He says, actually, if you look in the Torah never points to anybody and says, behave like him or behave like her. Because we don't idealize people. Who does the Torah say we should emulate, actually? The Almighty. That's the being. I was going to say the person. It's not a person, right? That's the being that we need to emulate. We need to look up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is just, I'm going to be just. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is merciful, I'm going to be merciful. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives to the poor, I will give to the poor. That is where we look to get our inspiration. Try to be godly. Yes, we can look at great people and say they're great, and maybe I can emulate the great people. But it's interesting that he says within the Torah, it's not about emulating great people, it's about emulating HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There is where greatness lies. Because however great Avraham Avinu was, he didn't come anywhere near Hashem. However great Moshe Rabbeinu was, he never come anywhere near Hashem. So the greatest we could have is Hashem himself. So why not try to emulate God? Become a godly person. And the fact, he says, and this is the important thing, even if Ramban says, as he makes this as a side point, even if Ramban says that they made a mistake, that Avraham Avinu made a mistake, it shouldn't put us off Avraham Avinu and go, so Avraham Avinu also made mistakes. No, but that's the greatness of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu is human, he can make mistakes, and he still became Avraham Avinu. That's the greatness of Avraham. To become Avraham Avinu despite the fact that he's a human being. Despite the fact that he's not infallible. To become Avraham Avinu as an infallible person, great, big deal. So you became Avraham Avinu because you're infallible. And it means that I, as a regular human being, have nothing to learn from you. I can't emulate Avraham Avinu because Avraham Avinu is infallible, and I am fallible. Very fallible. And that gives us a chance to look at our great people and to say, you know what? I can also become great. I'll emulate God, but I'll look at Avraham Avinu. I can look at others for inspiration in ways of becoming great. That's what Rav Hirsch says. And that's, I think, sort of like as you start looking at the entire Sefer of Bereshis, and you'll see all sorts of stories. And sometimes you'll scratch your head and you say, I don't understand the stories, and I don't understand the characters behind the stories, because they were big tzaddikim, and how did they do these things? And the answer is obviously, number one, we cannot really judge them and look at them and go, oh, they all made mistakes the way you and I make mistakes. Because they're not you and me. God doesn't communicate with us and communicated with them. There's a reason God communicated with them, is because they were much, much greater than we were. God would never decide to communicate with me. Just don't have what it takes. I just don't have it. Finished. End of story. And nobody in this generation. Avraham Avinu, God did communicate with him, so he was tremendously great. And yet he could still make mistakes. And yet he could still err. And that for us is to understand the greatness of the Torah. And that's part of it also. The greatness of the Torah, writes of Hirsch, lies within the fact that the Torah is willing to, well, if we call vilify in inverted commas, but willing to vilify its great people. Willing to say, you know what, Avraham Avinu, not perfect. Yitzchak, not perfect. Yaakov, not perfect. None of them are perfect. Many other religions, you look at their deities and they're perfect. You look at their prophets, they're perfect. You better not say anything about my prophet. It could cost you your head. Yeah, we're not going to go there. Don't even make comics about it. Now, we'd also get upset, by the way, we'd also get upset if people made fun of our things. I don't know if we're going to be killing people, but, it's not something that we take lightly either. But on the other hand, we also understand that our prophets were human beings. They were, in the end of the day, humans. And that the Torah is willing to tell us that they're humans, and the Torah is willing to tell us, yes, they made mistakes. They weren't perfect. Don't believe that in this whole picture of perfection, because it's not true. Okay? That's the first idea that I wanted to share with you here tonight about this. Okay, now we move on to something that Rav Schwab says. And here is a very interesting thought that Rav Schwab gives about the first words in the Pasha. Vayom Hashem Avram, Hashem says to Avram, Lech Lecha, go for yourself, me'atzecha, from your land, u'mimalatcha, and your birthplace, u'mibeis avicha, and your father's house, ela'atz ashareka, to the land that I will show you. And there I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and you will be a blessing to the whole world, etc., etc. That's the one time Avram Avinu is told Lech Lecha. There's another time Avram Avinu is told Lech Lecha, and that's much, much further down. We actually just read about it on Rosh Hashanah on the second day. And there we have the following verse. This is, if you wanted to look it up in the Chumash, you'd be looking at chapter 21, I think. Actually, beyond that, we'd even look at chapter 22. Now we're talking about the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And that was after these words, or after these things. And God decided to test Avram. And he says to him, Avram, and he says, Kachna, please take, as bincha, your son, as yechitcha, your only one, asher hafta, whom you love, as Yitzchak. And now here comes the words. What's the next two words? Velech lecha, and go for yourself al Eretz HaMoriah. So again, the word Lech Lecha comes up over here. The first test that we read about for Avram, we have the word Lech Lecha. And the final test that we have for Avram, we read the word Lech Lecha. And is there a connection between the two Lech Lechas? And even more importantly, the Medrash says there is a connection. And the Medrash wonders which Lech Lecha presented a greater test to Avram Avinu. Was it the Lech Lecha of leaving his household and his family? Or was it the Lech Lecha of sacrificing his son? And Rav Schwab asked the question, he says, I don't understand. If you were to put the two of them on a scale and say, you got two things, two jobs. Number one, you got to sacrifice your son. Number two, you got to leave your homeland. Which one of the two is going to be the more difficult test? Certainly sacrificing your son is much more difficult than leaving your homeland. You know, I've moved countries many times, right? So at 14, I moved countries and I moved to America and started all over again. And at 18, I moved to Israel and I started all over again. And at 21, I moved to a new yeshiva and that was almost starting all over again. And then at 23, I got married and I moved back to a new neighborhood and I started almost all over again. And then at 27, I moved to Manchester and I started all over again. And I would say even moving to this community is starting again because it's starting with a whole bunch of new people that I've never known before. I remember when I came here the first few weeks and I'm looking around and I remember thinking to myself, who is everybody? I don't know who these people are. And even though they introduced themselves to me last week and the week before, embarrassingly enough, I don't know their names and I don't know anything about them. And I don't know if they're married or not married, and I don't know if they have kids, and I don't know if they have grandchildren. And Baruch Hashem, now 10 years down the line, it's a very different story. But the first few weeks, it's starting with a whole new social circle. It's starting all over again. So it's not impossible. What? Well, the changing, correct. Yeah, it's all your experiences that even make you the person that you are. True. But what Rav Schwab says is when the Medrash asks the question, which one of these two tests is more difficult? How do you even ask the question? Moving house or sacrificing your son? Yeah, I think that wouldn't pose me a very big question. So Rav Schwab says, and here it's understanding. I think when you start to understand the deeper meaning of the tests, you start to realize that it wasn't so simple. Both of these tests are not as simple as they seem. Whereas, okay, the test of sacrificing your son is already a very difficult test, but it's much deeper and much more complicated than you see it as well. And the test of leaving your home is also, when we grow up and when you're 4 or 5 years old, your teacher tells you, Avraham Avinu was told when he was X years old, 75 years old, leave your household and leave your parents and go to a land and I will give you great blessing. And he did it. And we're all like, wow, Avraham Avinu moved house. Yeah? But that is a very juvenile way of looking at things. That's not giving it any more depth other than my 4 or 5-year-old eyes looking at this and saying, wow, it will be really hard for me to leave Manchester now and move to New York or move to Paris where I don't speak the language, right? It would be very difficult for me to move to Paris now where I don't speak the language. It would. But that's not Avraham Avinu's test. It must deeper than that. It's not just me who doesn't understand things like, it would have been really difficult to move countries. So what Rav Schwab says is you must realize that within each one of these tests, there was another test that was part of it that makes it extremely complicated. And let me explain the 2 tests to you this way. Let's start really with the sacrificing of the son, and then let's make our way back to leaving your household. Sacrificing his son. It was obviously a very difficult test in the fact that, number one, sacrificing a child is never an easy thing. I don't think anybody wants to sacrifice their child. Nobody. That's number one. Number two, he had been promised by God that Isaac will be the progenitor of your lineage, and now he's going to sacrifice that son. Well, how does that make sense? How do you explain that? God, can you explain that to me? You said A, and now you're saying not A, and how am I supposed to marry the two together? So that's a big question. But beyond that, what was Avraham Avinu preaching to the world for well over 100 years? God is a merciful God, and God doesn't want human sacrifice, and God never asked you to do this, and don't do it because it's wrong and because it's barbaric and etc., etc. You go through the whole discussion. And for 100 years, you were saying to the whole world, monotheism teaches you that this is not what we do, and this is wrong, and I expect you to not do that. And now imagine, let's use the word that people like to use nowadays. Imagine the Chilul Hashem that would result from him sacrificing his own son. Imagine what happens now. He comes down from the mountain and people say, he went up with 2. Where's number 2? Well, he's on the mountain. Well, is he not going to be coming back down? It's a little bit difficult with a slit throat. Who slit his throat? I did. Why? God said so. You? You, the one who's been going on and on and on about this? You're pulling the plug on everything you believed in? Remember years ago, I said this in a sermon, and to me, it still rings very, very true. Lance Armstrong. You guys remember Lance Armstrong? Now he's gone. People have forgotten about him. I don't remember how many years ago it was. When was the doping scandal with Lance Armstrong? How many years ago was that? Probably 8 years ago or something like that. 7, 8 years ago. So quite a while ago now. But do you remember when Lance Armstrong, he won 7 Tour de France? And everyone said, this guy's unbeatable. He had testicular cancer, and he overcame it. And the treatments and everything else. And he trained again, and he won the Tour de France not once, and not twice, and not 3 times, but 7 times. This guy is the winner of all winners. He beat a sickness that kills other people, and he retrained himself, and he was able to win. He is the amazing winner. Do you know people used to pay him $250,000 to come and give one speech? He was an inspirational speaker, and everybody looked at the guy and said, this guy was an inspiration. He was amazing. And then the story broke. He was a cheat. Now, lots of people have cheated in sports. But the issue with Lance Armstrong is that everyone always said, look at what a winner he is. Look at the fact that this guy's a warrior. He overcame all these difficulties to become the Lance Armstrong that he is. How amazing is Lance Armstrong? And when you say that again and again, and the whole sporting world thinks you are the bee's knees, and you turn out to be a cheater, that's bad. That's not just a little bit bad. That's really bad. And Avraham Avinu for 100 years tells the entire world, no human sacrifices. And he sacrifices his own son. Guess what happens to his entire religion? Guess what happens to all his credibility? Guess what happens to all the people that believe in monotheism? Gone. In a second, in a flash, he would be left with not a single individual that would believe in his mission. And not only does he lose his child now, he loses his entire life's mission. He loses the ticket to monotheism. He loses the whole thing, and the entire world says, this guy is just full of baloney. That's it. That's what they're going to say. Now, with Avraham Avinu leaving his household, his father was still alive. He had family. And you know what? There are times, and I've heard this before, and I know I've had conversation with people about this before, where people have called me up and said, my children have become frum and they don't eat by me anymore, or they don't want to do X and they don't know Y, and where is their kibbun ava'im, and this is a chilul Hashem that a frum person should behave like that. How many of us have heard these kind of comments? Clive, you must have heard comments similar to that before, that people saying that. Yeah? People say that. You can
solve it because everybody can change.
Yeah. So, look, you can solve it. It's not an unsolvable problem. It's actually not such a massive problem. And I think if people are willing, it's a problem that's easily overcome. Oftentimes, the other side is not so willing either. No, my son's become frum, and he needs to get rid of his whole life's plans, and he needs to get rid of his whole life's dreams because he's not eating supper in my house. Can't you just go to Shefa and buy something? Can we not find some kind of middle, Why does this child who has a dream that he wants to follow, or she has a dream that she wants to follow, have to suffer because you think it's really important that he eats the food that you've cooked? That's not fair. But many times that's what ends up happening. People end up getting punished for that, and they have that kind of thing. And they say it's a chilul Hashem, and I've heard people speak about it. Do you know what he does? Do you know how he speaks to his parents? His parents ask him to come along with them, and he says, no, I'm not willing to come to McDonald's with you. Is that what they teach him in yeshiva? That's the education that he gets. His parents want to buy him a meal, and he says no, and he's not even willing to come along and just to drink a soda? Is that what they taught you in yeshiva, you frummer? Yeah? You've heard that before. That's the kind of talk that people get sometimes. And here's the same thing. Oh, Avraham Avinu, the man of God, the guy who's going around and telling everybody what it's like to be good. He's got an elderly father, and you know what he does with that elderly father? Leaves him behind in an old age home to be cared for by some strangers, and he goes off to follow his dreams, just ditching his dad. It's really hard because kids sometimes, it's almost unfair on kids. Sometimes we put this strain on children, and especially, my wife said when my father-in-law, Oliver Shalom, was very, very ill, she said she felt a real pressure because she was the only child in town. She has only one sister, and that sister didn't live here, and it meant the entire pressure of helping her mother and helping her late father, it was on her. It was only her. There was nobody else to do this. And it's very, very pressurizing. And I remember my wife told me, we went to camp and we went on holiday. Baruch Hashem, a holiday was only 40 minutes away from here. And she said she felt absolutely terrible because she was getting phone calls from people who were saying to her, do you know your father's not being visited by anyone? Your father is in the MRI and he's just lying there and nobody's going to visit. Now, he was getting almost daily visits from people. But when everybody went on holiday, then he didn't get those visits. And my mother-in-law would find it very, very difficult to get to MRI. And she it was difficult. And the lifts that she normally would have, she couldn't have. And with the taxi, she was having an issue as well. And then people were saying to my wife, but your father's not being visited. My wife's like, but I'm in camp. I'm on holiday with my kids. And now you're being squeezed on both sides. Your kids need you here, your father needs you there. What are you supposed to do? And people look at you and they make judgments about you. And imagine the judgments that people would make about Avraham Avinu. This guy is so frum. If he's so frum, he wouldn't ditch his dad, leave him behind someplace Ur Kasdim as an elderly man and go chase his dream. What, that's the kind of God that he's going to follow, that tells him to ditch his elderly father and to chase a dream, to go after a land where he doesn't even know where he's going to go to, what he's going to do there, how he's going to live there without any money? Just leave your father behind like that? Imagine the resulting chilul Hashem of what people say about Avraham Avinu. And so therefore says Rav Schwab, the question of the test, both the test of Lech Lecha and the test of the Akedah, is not just simple. Of course, there's a simple element. It's hard to move places. It's impossible to shech your child. Forget about hard. It's an impossible task. But beyond that, that's not all that's in it. There's more to it. What we're saying is, I'm going to be doing God's will, and by doing God's will, I'm going to make the entire world angry with me. I'm going to have the entire world look at me and say, if that's godliness, I want nothing to do with it. I want absolutely nothing to do with it. You know, I mean, for years there were people that were missionaries used to knock on the door. We've not had it. Has anybody had a missionary knock on the door recently? Have you had any of that? You had them knocking on your door, Clive? No.
Yeah, but years ago, not recently.
Years ago. It's years since they used to do it. I think they've stopped. Yeah.
They've given up in this area. Yeah.
I think they've given up, but I think what's good. But they used to knock on. And there are certain people that used to just close the door on them, and certain people that used to sort of listen to them and go, oh, very nice. And some people I know were really cantankerous, and they used to argue with them. And friends of mine, like, you know, I have friends that have all sorts of stories. You know, one of my friends came out and with a chumash, and he said to the guy, by the way, can I read to you a passage over here? And he read out a passage from the chumash. He said, this passage says that Jesus is not God. He says, no, it doesn't. He says, well, okay, well, what does it say? He goes, I don't know. Why not? It says Hebrew. So how can you come and tell me what my Torah says? You don't even read my language. You got a translation, and you can't even tell me what it says. Somebody who doesn't know the original can't tell me what to say. Yeah, a lot of people said different things. We've had different interesting arguments. But some people have gone with the other argument. When they knocked on the door, they opened up, and the Christians are standing there. He says, you know what? Over the years, your people have killed millions of my people in a religious war. Millions of my people have suffered because people from the church have done terrible things to the people of my nation. So you're asking me to join you now? You want to tell me that you guys are the religion of love and of tolerance? Have you ever read a Christian history book? I don't think that reads as a religion of tolerance or of niceness. Or, you know, forget it. Out. Here's the door. I'm not joining you. I'd rather leave. I'd rather stay with our people and go. I'd rather go to hell with the Jews than go to heaven with the Christians. Yeah? But that's true. People look at that and they say, I don't want anything. I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want part of this. I'm not going to have any part of this religion where a guy leaves his old father behind. I'm not a part of a religion where a guy shechts his own child. And now you realize that Avraham Avinu is being put in an almost impossible situation. Because if he does what God says, it's a chil Hashem. If he doesn't do what God says, it's also a chil Hashem. Now what? And he's got to go ahead, he's got to say, you know what? Even if, and because his whole life mission is bringing people closer to God, and he's doing things for God that's going to pull people away from God, he's now in a very, very sticky situation. And that is where Avraham Avinu, that's why we say we don't know which one of these tests is greater. Because understanding those tests means understanding deeply that it's actually a lot more complicated than just the simple way of looking at these tests that we always have looked at this way when we were younger. Okay, let's see. We'll say one last thought or one last idea, and we'll leave it with that.
Can I ask you?
Yes, sure, I'm listening, Clive.
The Akedah for all of us is the ultimate peak.
Yes.
Of Avram. You know, we read it on Yom Kippur. We read it, you know, on Rosh
Yeah.
So we don't spend much time reading about Lech Lecha from
Okay, so you're right. I didn't go back. I mean, the Gemara answers. The Gemara says obviously that the Akedah was greater. The Gemara does say the Akedah was greater, right? But I was just, coming down on the question more than on the answer and saying, well, if the Gemara asked this question or the Midrash asked this question, then there must be something deeper to the Akedah and there must be something deeper to Lech Lecha than just what meets the eye. Of course, you're right that in the end of the day, the Akedah is the ultimate test, and that's the thing that we look at as Avram's ultimate achievement. And God says to him there, Ato yadatki elekim ato. Now I know that you are God-fearing. Now I can say beyond any shadow of a doubt, I say jump, you say how high. Whether it makes sense to you whether it makes no sense to you, whether it means your entire life's work goes down the drain, you say jump and I say how high. And that's the amazing thing. So you're right, 100%. Okay. You know what? Let's leave it here. We won't do that last idea. We'll leave it here. Thank you so much again for joining me. Thank you for those of you who joined us on Facebook Live, and those who joined us on Zoom, for those who joined us on Torah anytime, and for those who are in person. If you want to get in touch, davideisenberg@gmail.com, and we look forward to seeing you all in Meretz Hashem, similar time next week.
Thank you.
Shkaya, thank you very much.
Thank you.